My name is Madeline Mackay, and I've just completed an MFA in Printmaking at the University of Alberta. The work that you see here is my MFA thesis exhibition, which is the final submission for the programme. The title of the exhibition is Not Yet Earth, and in making this work, I was thinking about where the body ends and where other things begin, and also about where the self ends and the body begins. So about these in-between spaces that maybe we don't necessarily really think about in our day-to-day lives. The reason why this became very interesting to me was about 2 years ago, I got quite ill. And suddenly it seemed like my body was doing these things that I had no control over and that weren't in my interest. And this really caused me to question whether my body really was myself. And so I started to explore sort of what this in-between space was, where my self stopped overlapping with my body. So when I began making this work, I started with strips of meat. And I chose meat because it's not self or body or other, but it does have aspects of all of these. So I took the strips of meat and I made arrangements and patterns with them, and I sort of structured them into knots. And then the process became a constant kind of arranging and rearranging of these strands, which underlies all of the work in this exhibition. And this kind of ritual process, to me, spoke to the need to regain a sense of control over a body that I had lost a feeling of being in direction of. So these are a series of drawings on Asian paper using lithographic crayon. And in making these works, I was really thinking about my body in relation to them. So the dimensions are designed to reflect the dimensions of the body, so they have this kind of tall and narrow format, so that when the viewer stands in front of them, they're really relating to it with their body. When I made the drawings, I would decide where the kind of focal point, the kind of knotted strands in the drawing would sit by putting my feet on a level with the bottom of the paper, and then standing in front of the drawing and actually feeling out with my own body where the kind of parts of my body that I felt really centered on my sort of anxiety about this strange rift with my body that happened because of my illness. So this is a bank of etchings. They're made using a technique called soap ground combined with aquatint. And they take the imagery of the meat strands in a much more abstract direction. So the scale becomes very difficult to read. It's hard to tell whether we're looking at something on a cellular scale, like maybe some tiny part of the human body that's too small to see with the naked eye, or whether we're looking at something massive that could be on a landscape scale. All we know for sure, really, is that we're looking at something biological. The strands in this series seem to be floating. It's hard to tell whether this is the same as in some of the other works where the strands are sort of floating in pools of water, or whether it's more of a metaphorical floating in this kind of limbo between living and not living material. So the way that I made these etchings is by creating 9 original plates, that is copper plates, and then I layered them on top of each other. And so I would make a plate and then decide as I went what else was needed in the series. So for example, I began with this kind of very tightly knotted form that's really quite sort of focused in the center of the image. And then I went on to make more loose, kind of spread out images of the strands, and others that had a much more sort of systematic linear arrangement. And when I was layering up the plates, I found it interesting that you would get kind of repetitions between one print and the next, even though none of them was exactly the same as any of the others. So for example, this one, you can see some of the marks repeated in this image because I printed the same plate in both images, but I also printed other plates in this one as well. So these prints are CMYK screen prints, and what that means is that the image has been broken down and the colours have been separated into 4 separate layers, and then they've been built back up. This was a very important process to me in making decisions about this series, because by breaking down the colour and then reproducing it, you change it quite dramatically. So for example, you can see here that the meat has taken on kind of a yellowish acidic tinge that was not in the original photograph, but it's just kind of crept in through the process. This kind of switching of one colour with another, and just shifting of colour, to me broke down the separation between the different materials that I was working with. So it becomes much less clear exactly where mud ends, this mud that I'm working with, and the meat strands and the water. There's less definition between them because there's this sort of brownish yellowish colour that's coming into the meat and other colours that are just sort of switching places with each other. So again, in this image, you can see that the mud in the top corner here has taken on a kind of fleshy pink colour, and this really, again, starts to break down the separation between what's meat and what is mud. Another thing that I found when making these images was that they have a real quietness to them that maybe is not found in the other work, where there's a lot of movement from the sort of the motion of the strands and the gestural drawing techniques that I'm using. These are still shots from some of the performative pieces that I did of rearranging the meat. So these are just inter-moments in this sort of ritual of interacting with the meat. So these pieces are screen prints on aluminium, which is layered with projected video. And in these works, again, I was really exploring the kind of fluid boundaries between the different materials that I'm working with. So the mud, the water, the meat, and my own body. And the transparency of the projection is very important to this, because it makes it very ambiguous where, for example, arm ends and mud and meat begin, since you see one through the other. So I came all the way from Scotland to study at the University of Alberta, and it's been an incredible experience. I've been able to work with some incredible artists and printmakers, including Madeline Oliver, Sean Caulfield, Liz Ingram, and I've learned so much just about professional practice and printmaking, and just having a solid art practice and creating work that I can really keep making for years to come. The Edmonton community has been incredibly welcoming and warm, and just the people that I've worked with, the fellow grad students, faculty across the university, have made this a really wonderful experience.